Incomprehensible Fragments. Spring, 1981. Somewhere around Menominee, I started crying. I cried because the cornfields looked so cold and silent with their frozen clods. I cried because Hershey looked just like Menominee, and Wilson looked just like Hershey, and they all looked like Woodville Corner, and none of them looked like home. I cried because I was a stranger in Wisconsin, and I would soon be a stranger in Minnesota, and the chances were that wherever I went, I would feel the distance between my head and feet. I cried because I wanted to touch the earth, and I could not seem to find the pulsing vein. I cried for all the sweet sorrows to which flesh is heir, and I cried because the hills were very old. And I cried for a gypsy girl in Iowa whose thoughts lay with a young cement layer in Missoula, Montana. And through that land of cheese we sped as the sky and the earth pinched together behind us and shot us down the highway like a glob of toothpaste aimed at Minneapolis. It was a bus full of silent people who read the National Enquirer's predictions for spring, or waded knee-deep in Tolstoy, or just sat looking out the windows, listening vaguely to country western radio. 26 mute apes quietly masticating or puffing the cigarettes that hung upon their simian lips or rested in their knobby fingers. 26 animals with an ability for refined communication whose only shared experience was the passing scenery. Lemon-perfumed disinfectant from the restroom hung over the aisle and seeped into the upholstery and the clothing and the hair and worked its way through skin and flesh, seeking out the marrow of the bones. And only the engine hum, punctuated occasionally by a smoker's cough. And there were no hills. The land was flat and lonely. The earth had opened to the sun and now lay exhausted and spent in the winter air. And the embryonic offspring sliding helplessly across that vast belly towards Minneapolis cried out for worms, but only within the safety of the silent heart. No words were spoken. To speak is to confess. But the gypsy girl had read the cards. The daughter of Martin Luther, she of the $1 million smile, did not sigh for me, but for a young man in Missoula, Montana. And somewhere around Menominee, I cried. I cried for the big square frame houses and for the porch swings and the peeling picket fences. I cried for the monuments in the town squares and for the abandoned train depots and for the last houses on the edges of the towns and for the white barns and the shiny sugar-frosted fields. But most of all, I cried for the tears that never came, and the cry that never broke the surface, but rather settled in a hard knot in my throat. What a pity the earth has no edges. What a pity the sky has no end. Minnesota was a land of sunsets and frozen lakes. The cities breathed and the people smiled. St. Paul is Catholic and Minneapolis is Lutheran, and the great river that divides them is one in which all tears are thrown and carried away down south past the gates of New Orleans and out into the Gulf where they become food for exotic fish. There is the great pile of cast-off skins, beyond which lies the land of promise. New faces boarded the bus, chattering in the twilight and leaching the lemon disinfectant from the marrow of the bones. Life is so long and so short, and we are so old and so young. Behind me, 2 boys spin pubescent fantasies, and ahead of me an old man told of the last time he was through here back in 27, and the moon rose gently and embraced us all. And the gypsy girl smiled from 10,000 stars, and the knotted throat relaxed. Somewhere around St. Cloud, someone began to sing very quietly, and I heard it before I realized it was me. And one by one, the conversations faded, and the books were laid aside, and the lights were clicked out, and the skulls were rested against the cold glass. The singing faded and disappeared in the hum, as Mother Greyhound slid through the night, westward to the border. North Dakota was steeped in darkness, a place of eternal night, where people huddled in small groups under street lamps like moths, seeking to put some color into their pale green skins. It was a place of empty streets and closed shops, of towns that loomed eerily out of the night and then receded again into nothing. A place of bony trees and cold, quiet neon. The only people who lived there were the nocturnal waitresses who inhabit the oases of light and who spoke only in monosyllables as they served coffee to strangers and walked away jingling. And we who awoke heard Charon's oars rattling and prayed for safe passage through the haunted night. Eastern Montana, land of brown crust, land of knobs and cracks, of savage winds and bitter springs, where the power line towers stand like great lonely giants bearing the cables of twisted copper through which crackle the jumbled mutterings of a million mouths, and upon which travels the power from 1,000 rivers, where great iron mosquitoes suck the earth for black crude, and the iron horses haul their weary loads westward to the sea. And the long, lazy highway stretches seductively across it all, soaking up the early morning rays. And through the rawhide towns of spurs and creaking wooden porches, the gypsy girl had left a trail of flowers that led westward along the broad, wide, shallow river bordered by aspen, between the rimrock canyons and the places of yellow stone, past the broken houses and across the vast plain which slowly climbed the edge of the sky to the mountains. Livingston, where the trucks roll in from the south, Bozeman, beneath a hole in the sky from whence cometh the snow, Butte, the richest hill in the world, now dreaming in the sunset of better days long gone. And somewhere around Big Timber, I started smiling. I smiled because the mountains were young and the snow was fresh. I smiled because the streams ran over beds of flat rocks, and because the cows hung by their toenails from steep pastures. And I smiled because the air was cold and life was new, and because I was on a busload of fools heading west into the night. Somewhere in the wrinkles and folds of the Rocky Mountains, we passed through a land of spirits. In the infected air, two old men spoke of death and poison, of suicides and cancer, made lists of all the people once known and loved, now dead, and spoke without visible emotion of mortal passage. Three babies communicated in wails of the agony of hunger and the incomprehensibility of present circumstances. An old woman at the back coughed horribly and spat up bits of her tubercular lung. Near the front, another old woman spoke emotionally to the empty seat beside her and cursed it repeatedly. "I shit all over you every 7 years." And through it all, I kept my eyes fixed on the tiny toenail moon that led westward out of the sickness to a place of crossed paths, the place where memories begin. Missoula was the long-awaited seismic center of nostalgic association. And in that glaring depot, ghosts came and went, but they did not bother me. They wore flowers in their hair and spoke of approaching snow. I said a quick prayer for a young man across town whose thoughts lay with a gypsy girl from Iowa, and then drifted up to float among the stars. Andromeda was there, as was Orion, bringer of storms, and the 7 sisters of Norway, playing with the little bear whose name was Rasputin, and who wheezed and puffed and ran to meet me. I looked down at the tiny bus winding its way through the wrinkles and folds, painfully navigating the maze with its cargo of 34 sacks of guts, all crying and coughing and sad. And I reached down and placed a pair of white lace wings on its roof. It rose gently above the timbered gorges and hovered, and I reached behind it and pinched together sky and earth and shot that bus like a glob of toothpaste westward toward Seattle. The next day was God's day. Even the unbelievers could feel it in their bones. It was a blessed morning. The apple orchards of the Columbia drank in the white light and blossomed before our eyes. The coulees filled with glacial runoff, and the geese circled in a V and turned north. The Cascades above Leavenworth rang with the echo of 1,000 voices. The highway, too, smelled the stable and began the descent, past Mount Index, the naked spire, down the Skykomish River boiling in its bed, past the snowy towns still blinking from hibernation, down to the plain that leads to the inland sea, with its ships and cities, seals and seaweed, and the smell of salt from the Orient. Down through the pines and cedars to the blanket of furs, with gypsy girls in our pockets and home in our nostrils, down to the first day of spring.